Hey, School Bus here, welcoming you to the third episode of History versus World of Tanks. And today we're going to talk about the engines used in these World War II tanks. And if you don't know this about School Bus yet, you will know after this episode. I'm a bit of a gearhead. I like car engines, I like aircraft engines. I'm learning a lot about tank engines as I get more into World of Tanks and some of the history behind it. So, stick around today if you want to know things like, why is a Sherman tank so tall? Was the Tiger tank diesel-powered, or was it gasoline-powered? Are the engines that we see in World of Tanks when we go through the tech tree, are those actually the engines that were used in the tanks? And then lastly, we'll bring all that together and look at, do these historical elements have any effect on the gameplay within World of Tanks? So if you're interested in any of that, stick around, check this out. I think you'll enjoy today's content. Starting out first here, we'll look at the US and some of their famous engines. So most notably, the US tended to use radial engines in a lot of their popular tanks. So starting out with the R670 and the M1, M2, and M3, and then moving up to the Wright R975 in the M4 Sherman and the M18 Hellcat. And then they went even bigger in the test prototypes for the T1 Heavy and the M6 in the form of the 1820 radial. And then also we have Ford. They did some interesting things where first they started out saying, hey, we're just going to lease the design of the British Meteor engine and use that. And then they decided, well, no, we're not going to use that. We're going to develop our own design. Well, then the war started to get kind of serious and they were running out of time. So then they went back to the plan of, all right, fine, let's lease the Meteor engine from the Brits. And so they came up with a version that instead of being 12 cylinders was 8 cylinders. And they used that in a few tanks, and then when they needed a bigger engine, they went back and they added on the 4 cylinders, and they had a larger 12-cylinder version that was then used in the T-29, T-30, and T-34 program. And in regards to diesel engines, the M4 Sherman, when used by the Marines, actually was built as a diesel. The Marines wanted to be able to commonize the fuel type being used across all of their ships and their tanks and their vehicles, and so they ended up using a General Motors engine variant that was diesel powered. So we'll start out first going into some detail on the R975 radial engine. This was used in the M4 Sherman, among others. It was also used in the M10 and the M18 Hellcat. One interesting thing about the use in the Hellcat was that with this lightweight, high-powered engine in that lightweight, relatively small tank, it was the fastest tracked armored vehicle in the world until the turbine-powered M1 Abrams came out in the 80s. That's pretty impressive. Have a World War II vehicle that held a record all the way up through the 80s. So why was this engine so awesome? Well, it only weighed about 300 kilograms, and it could produce 300 to 450 horsepower. And when you compare that power to weight ratio of that engine versus, say, the British Meteor engine, which was about 600 horsepower and weighed 600 to 700 kilograms, and then you've got the Russians at about 600 horsepower at 1,000 kilograms. And then you've got the Germans at about 600 horsepower at 1,300 kilograms. Yeah, technically you've got a little less horsepower here, but that's a lot less weight. And that adds a fair amount to the performance of the vehicles. Now, one side effect you could call it of using the radial engines was that you needed a tank that was tall enough to handle the really high or tall engine, and yet it was a fairly short engine, so you could keep the vehicle a bit shorter. And so if you look here, the comparison of the US tanks on the left and then some of their contemporaries from other nations on the right, you can see that the Sherman and the M3 are a lot taller than the Cromwell or the T-34. And a lot of that comes to do with the packaging that you need to do around that particular engine that's being used. Another nuance to using the radial engines is that when they would sit, as with all radials, the oil pools in the lower cylinders. So you will see in the next clip here, there was a port that they could extend a shaft in through the back of the tank that would index onto this little spline that would let them rotate the engine over by hand before starting the engine. I think they could also do it with the starter with the fuel cut off, but anyway, notice that in this next clip.
Okay.
Here we have the R1820 radial engine by Curtiss-Wright. This is a bigger version of the R975. This engine is not very famous for its use in vehicles, but was made famous instead by its use in the B-17 Flying Fortress. And although it didn't see much use in vehicles, where we know about it from a game of World of Tanks is that there was also a G200 variant that was 900 horsepower, and it was used in the M6 heavy tank. And although it didn't actually see any form of production, this was a pretty interesting attempt for the U.S. going into the heavy tank production. And again, just like on the Sherman, it is likely the tall stature of that vehicle had a lot to do with trying to mount a radial engine vertically inside of the hull. You would need quite a bit of clearance to be able to fit that type of an engine in there. The Russians offer a very unique, different take on tank engines, and arguably it's the one that I would have expected to be more of the norm, and I think a lot of the rest of you would have thought that you'd use in big heavy machines, you'd use big diesel engines with lots of torque, maybe sacrificing some horsepower, but having a lot of torque. And that's exactly what the Russians did. And this V2 engine was used across the board. As you can see here on the screen, you go all the way from the BT-7 up through the T-10, and then also in the SU tank destroyers from the 85 up through the 152. And though it doesn't show it on here, I bet you would find that a lot of the prototypes that we see in the Russian tank trees also use a derivative of this engine as well. It wasn't a light engine, but compared to, say, the German engines, it was a bit lighter, more displacement. You're looking at about 38 to 39 liters here, where the other engines we'll be looking at in this series are down more in the mid 20-liter range. But despite that extra displacement, the weight of these engines is not that excessive at about 1,000 kilograms, and you have power output up to around 600 horsepower when it's used in the KV1 and the KV2 variants. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the history of this engine and what led to this design. That the Russians, they had good reason for why they chose a diesel engine, and let's talk a little bit more about that. So what the Russians had the advantage of with their engine development was that they knew that war was coming, and they were planning well ahead of that. And in so doing, they went a direction that allowed them to save fuel a bit, because they wanted to make sure they had something that was, from a resource standpoint, going to be sustainable. And that was a lot of the reason they chose diesel. And they were also able to very intelligently look at their various engine designs being used elsewhere, namely the aviation industry, and be able to take some time to refine and change that design into something that could be used in a tank. And as I read up on these engines, the only major flaw I could find was that initially they did not use a very good air filtration system, and it would suck up all kinds of crap, and it didn't have a whole lot of longevity. Now, did that really matter a whole lot? Not really, because each tank, when they went on the battlefield, really only lasted about a week. The average T-34, being the specific example I'm citing here, it would only last a matter of a few days, and it was dead. So the fact that this engine, you would get about 130 to 200 kilometers out of it before it was dead, really didn't matter. So here's a cross-section of the V2 engine, and despite being diesel, it does have an aluminum block. And overall, you look at this, and if you're familiar with old aviation engines, it looks rather similar to a lot of those old aviation designs. So, rather novel design coming from Russia here in their World War II tanks. And that pretty well rounds it out for our discussion of history. This will be the first part in a two-part series, because I will also cover Germany and England as well. But that was just going to be a little too long of a video. So now we need to wrap this back up and take a look at how does this play into World of Tanks. There are three elements of what we've talked about today that play through into the game itself. The first and most obvious one is the horsepower. So 520 horsepower out of a radial. Yeah, that's certainly reasonable. Specifically the 975 radial. That's a turret, that's not an engine. Here we go, right Continental, 975. And so we start out at 400 up to 460, and then, oh, sorry, actually this is the 4GAA, which definitely, being the V8 version of the Meteor, yeah, 520 would be reasonable. Now, let's also look at the weight. Let's go in here to the engines, and we can see here that the first one weighs 516 kilograms, and then it goes up to 569. Let's see if that actually changes. So if we look over here, the right-hand side of the screen, we have 35.38 tons. We go in here, we change to this engine, and 35.33. So it's very small, but there is a difference. The weight of the engine is carrying through to the entire weight of the tank. So there's the second element. The third one, and arguably the most important one, is going back over here. We see the fire chance on these is 20%. So what if we were to look at a KV2, which we know has a diesel engine, and 15%. So the V5, the V2, 15, and then this MT17T is 20. Well, that had me curious, and did a little research on that, and actually that was a BMW design that the Russians were leasing from Germany, and this would have been back in like 1930 or so, and that was a gas engine. It was actually an aviation-derived gas engine. So it checks out. If it's 20%, it's gasoline powered. If it's 15%, it's diesel. I checked a few other examples like the TOG. I believe that one is a diesel, and it comes in at 15% fire chance as well. So you have to look through your various tanks to see which fuel type they're obviously using. And I don't believe there are any exceptions to 15 or 20 without actually applying your various crew skills, etc. So, hope this was helpful. Hope this was informative. Hope you enjoyed this video today. Well, thank you for watching this extra long episode today of History versus World of Tanks. And I'll be watching the stats to see how many of you actually made it through to the end. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you're enjoying the channel, please subscribe. It really keeps me motivated. Thanks for watching.